The .NET Framework has actually been around for quite a while. It was originally developed back in 2000 and 2001 by Microsoft to be a development platform to rival Java from Sun. The development platform started out with three primary languages: C#, C++, and VB.NET. And the fact that the platform provided three different languages was to help engage all the different possible users in the Microsoft ecosystem. C++ being the most common low-level language, VB being changed into VB.NET to bring in all of the Visual Basic developers, and then C# to be its own new language for .NET that was comparable to Java. The .NET languages then compiled down into what is referred to as IL code, or intermediate language code, which was then run against a JIT, or just-in-time compiler, that would then generate the native operating system code similar to what you would compile your C++ code into, which would be native code. So that code would then be picked up and run in your system as native application code. But the fact that it was compiled into an intermediate language allowed for that code to be ported from Windows to other operating systems. That was more of a dream than a reality for a long time, but you'll find now that most recently, with a lot of the new initiatives that Microsoft has put out, that has changed. The framework itself has evolved over time as well. Back in .NET version 1.0 and 2.0, the framework consisted of three primary pieces, including the Common Language Runtime, the CLR, framework libraries, and those made up primarily WinForms, ASP.NET, which is the web component of the .NET framework, and ADO.NET, which is the data access layer of the .NET framework that's used for things like SQL Server and other data access components. With the introduction of version 3.0, Microsoft actually introduced an entirely new framework set that included things such as Windows Presentation Foundation, Windows Communication Foundation, Windows Workflow Foundation, and Card Spaces. Those were great tools. Many of them are still used today, especially the Presentation Foundation and Communication Foundations. Presentation Foundation is used for a lot of the Windows 8 and newer style development. With the addition of .NET 3.5, additional functionality was added both to the runtime as well as additional libraries that were created to help developers. LINQ, which is a language integrated query functionality that's built right into the .NET framework and is primarily used within the C# and VB.NET spaces, allows you to write SQL-style queries against both databases, XML, and objects. The Entity Framework is something of a bolt-on framework to add additional layers of abstraction to database connections. It is considered an object relational mapper, where it'll take your database table designs and create .NET or CLR objects that you can use in your applications. It's actually a very powerful tool that allows you to model and map between a database and your business objects, and it continues to be iterated and evolved on to this day. There are even considerations from people where they believe that it is designed to be the replacement for ADO.NET. Performance-wise, ADO.NET still just works better. The .NET version 4 and 4.5 add-ons provide a lot of parallel computing functionality, and it's been something of an iterative process. Parallel link, so being able to run parallel or multi-threaded link-style queries, was introduced in .NET 4, as well as the task parallel library to be able to more simply create parallel execution paths, where if you had a large set of data that you needed to run calculations on, you could do it in parallel with your multi-threaded, multi-core processors. .NET 4.5 then took that one step further and actually introduced task-based async, and that has to do with long-running asynchronous processes. A good example of those is when your application needs to connect to a database. Well, in a synchronous world, your application basically stops the moment it connects to that database, and it has to then wait for the database to respond. So your application becomes locked or stuck. With an asynchronous model, the application makes that call, and then it goes into something of a wait and listen mode, where the application remains responsive, but it's actually waiting for the database to respond back, and you don't end up with application locking. Most of us are familiar with application locking, where the user interface will either stop responding entirely, or we get that nice white window because the application is waiting on something else to respond. At the same time, additional languages have been developed for the .NET framework as well. So C# and VB.NET are still the mainstays of the platform, but we now have additional languages such as Python and Ruby being introduced as IronPython and IronRuby, with the addition of functionality in .NET 3.5 and 4. Dynamic language support was created so that the ability to take your .NET based applications and write them in these dynamic languages and have them still compile through an IL compiler in JIT gives you a lot of interesting functionality and a lot more options in terms of development, depending on if you come from a different type of background, a different programming language. You can pretty much today find just about any language that you would want to write in that is .NET compatible. The .NET framework itself has evolved quite a bit over the last 10 or 15 years. This is a snapshot of the .NET 4 framework. It includes a lot of pieces of functionality, but this is broken out into 5 or 6 major quadrants, those being the core of the framework itself, and that includes things like your runtimes, your primary languages, the threading and multi-purpose, multi-threaded, parallel processing type technologies. And then on the outer edges of this diagram, you'll see things such as web and data, workflows, communication, and client. And these are touching on those different aspects of the framework that can work together, but they each kind of serve a unique purpose. So things in the web space are traditionally for ASP.NET development, for web-based development, but there are some overlaps and there are pieces of functionality that can be used even in command line applications. The communications framework has a lot to do with service-based development, so developing services within your applications or doing low-level networking type integrations with things like sockets and TCP/IP and doing raw HTTP and SMTP. The data segment is for ADO.NET and the entity framework. And the data segment is not restricted just to Microsoft technologies. The data segment actually includes plugin functionality for Oracle, any ODBC-based connectors, SQLite, MySQL, even NoSQL implementations like MongoDB. They all have data connectors that integrate and work within the .NET framework. The client-based segment in blue, that's actually one of the main focuses for this course, is we'll be developing a Windows-based client application that runs on the computer itself. So we'll be utilizing that heavily in this course, and that includes things like your Windows forms, your controls that you put on your forms, and a lot of those pieces of integration just to getting your application up and running. One of the things that I want you to kind of consider as you're looking at this diagram just holistically is that there's a lot of functionality within the .NET framework, and it's important for you to think outside the box of, I have a form and I have some controls and some buttons and text boxes, and this is all I have to work with. You can write a lot of functionality. You can do a lot of very interesting things utilizing a larger breadth of the framework, including things like manipulating XML, making HTTP requests. You can basically mimic browser-based functionality at a command line if you wanted to. So there's a lot of potential there, and it's really kind of just wrapping your mind around what's possible and then making it happen. And looking forward to the future of .NET, Microsoft has actually taken an initiative to, first of all, they're still supporting and maintaining the current .NET framework. They've just recently released ASP.NET 4.6 and ASP.NET 5 and the .NET Framework 4.6, as well as additional WPF and Windows Form functionality. Then, in parallel with that, they're currently open sourcing and developing a brand new framework core, and they're calling it the .NET Core. And that core is designed for very lightweight, multi-platform functionality. So that whole idea of compiling down to a common language runtime with an intermediate language compiled binary, and then being able to move it around to different computing platforms, different operating systems, is now actually becoming a reality. Microsoft actually went from the ground up and rebuilt that core of the .NET framework and did it in a way that is completely multifunctional, and they're actually directly supporting both Windows, Linux, and Macs. So the ability to begin to build true multi-platform applications is a thing now. That entire part of the framework, the .NET Core, is completely open source. It's available on GitHub, as well as the ASP.NET Core 1.0 framework. That was formerly called ASP.NET 5, or they use the code name ASP.VNext, and they just announced recently that they are moving it to ASP.NET Core and .NET Core, and they're both a version 1.0 because there's such a significant change in the paradigm of what the .NET framework is today. There's a good deal of compatibility between the two, but they are also unique, and they're working to move things from being a single monolith, like we saw in that giant diagram, to being more of a dynamic package-based solution where you can kind of pick and choose the functionality you want and put them together, so you're not having to take everything. You can just use the pieces that you want. All right, so hopefully that wasn't too painful. I hope that was a good introduction to the .NET framework as a whole, give you some understanding of where the framework came from and where we are today, and then even where we're going. And like I said before, be willing to kind of dig and explore within the framework itself. There's a lot of great functionality in there that you can utilize in your applications.